Well, good evening and welcome to this information session with the Institute for Human Ecology at Catholic University of America. My name is Anna Mitchell and I'm the co-host and the producer of the Sunrise Morning Show, which you can hear at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. And if you don't happen to have an EWTN affiliate in your area, you can go to sunrisemorningshow.com, sonrisemorningshow.com, and listen live there or via our app. And I am very happy to be here tonight with Bill Saunders. He's the director of the program in human rights for the Institute for Human Ecology. And tonight we will be talking about the purpose of this MA program in human rights, why it's relevant today, talking about the curriculum, professional advantages that this program offers, and more. So, Bill, it is so good to see you this evening.
Great to be with you and everybody online.
And before we get started with the conversation, just a couple of housekeeping notes for those of you who are tuning in. First, we would love to hear from you. So if you have any questions, if you're watching this live right now, if you're watching the recorded version, I'm sorry, we can't get your questions, but if you're watching live, feel free to submit your questions on the GoToWebinar panel at any time during the presentation, and they will get those questions to me that we can give to Bill that he can answer at the end. And secondly, as I just alluded to, this video is being recorded tonight, so if there's anything that you want to revisit or watch the entire thing or pass along to someone who you think would be interested in a master's degree in human rights, this will be available at mahumanrights.com, the website. So, Bill, first of all, I think just the basic fundamental question to start with is, why have a graduate program in human rights?
You know, it's a good question. There are other programs at other schools, but there's none like ours. So human rights is a topic that probably everybody, certainly heard of, and most people think favorably about. It resonates kind of with ordinary people. If you ask somebody coming up and down the street, are you in favor of human rights, they'd say yes. Now, I've been in DC for over 25 years. I've been involved in public policy for over 25 years. I've only been at Catholic University for a couple of years, and I was brought there to start this program, which I wanted to do because it partially grew out of my own experience of 25 years of participation in the public policy conversation, and my experience that conversation is extraordinarily impoverished. It lacks careful, thoughtful, helpful analysis, and I wanted to help that conversation by helping to shape and form young people to go out and make good arguments from the Catholic perspective. So our program is from the Catholic perspective. It's different from any other human rights program that I'm aware of, because in my experience, the Catholic perspective is usually missing in the human rights debates. And if you don't have that voice and that perspective, it impoverishes the debate. And therefore, we all suffer from it because we have public policy and public conversations that are just not on point or helpful.
Well, tell me this, what is the uniqueness of the Catholic perspective when it comes to the issues of human rights?
Well, as we were talking, you and I, before we came on the air, the person that's most influential in my own life, and for thousands, hundreds of thousands probably of other people, is John Paul II. And some of I know our listeners may be not as familiar with him, certainly because many of them were born in the last years of his pontificate, probably, but I lived through the heart of his pontificate. And John Paul II always insisted on engaging the human rights project. And he insisted on Catholicizing it in this sense. While some conservative people dismiss human rights as a project of the left, that's not true. Human rights grew out of the experience of the Second World War. And again, for people who may not have studied this in school, the Second World War was the most devastating war in human history. More than, now just stop and think about this, more than 55 million innocent non-combatants killed. There were another 25 million soldiers killed, but 55 million innocent civilians killed. So the Second World War led to the founding of the United Nations, and certainly the United Nations does some good stuff. I have some criticism of it as well, but the idea was, how do we prevent a World War III? Because World War II has been so devastating. If we have a World War III, the human race may be obliterated. So they established the United Nations, and they said, in order to have peace, we need to recognize and protect human rights. So it issued a statement called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the world has proceeded since then in 1945. And so it is not a left-wing project. It came out of a universal consensus. It was adopted by the UN with no countries voting against it. And now it is true that the left has tried to hijack it. But what did John Paul II say? Did he say, let's forget about human rights because the left is trying to hijack it? No, he said, we're going to engage it. We recognize the good in it. We recognize the important history behind it. We recognize the consensus in the world that existed to create it. And we are going to work with what is in the document, and we're going to, in a word that is typical of John Paul II, propose to all people of goodwill a deeper understanding. So I know this is a long answer, but just for people who aren't up to speed on this or haven't thought about this lately, you have this Universal Declaration, which some people say is just a list. It's not just a list, although it is a list. It's not just a list because if you know anything about Catholic social thought, you'll see reflected throughout the document teaching in Catholic social thought. And that's not a surprise because Jacques Maritain and others had a role in the development of the Universal Declaration. But in another sense, it is just a list because it doesn't give a comprehensive explanation of why this particular list. So what gives that comprehensive explanation and deeper understanding is Catholic thinking about Christian anthropology, the dignity of the human person, natural law and natural rights, the encyclical tradition of papal encyclical tradition, political theory heavily influenced by Christian thinking, Catholic thinking. So that's the Catholic difference. And then the last thing that makes the Catholic difference is the Catholic perspective is we insist on all of that being part of our approach. We're not just making a theological argument. We're not just making a philosophical argument. We're not just making a political argument. We're not just making a legal argument. We're not just making an anthropological argument. We have a rich, rounded or complete understanding of human rights. And so that's what makes the Catholic perspective different than you would get in any other program.
And so I imagine all of that is built into the curriculum for this MA in human rights?
Yeah, the great thing about the curriculum is it's an interdisciplinary program. So the degree is awarded by the School of Arts and Sciences, but with the participation of 4 other schools, which is law, canon law, philosophy, and theology. And you mentioned at the beginning, this degree program is a project of the Institute for Human Ecology. which is a fairly new institute at Catholic University. It's about 3 years old, but it has fellows. So, and they come from the different schools. So the program courses, the curriculum, the courses are taught by fellows of the Institute who are faculty members at Catholic University. And I teach it. And then, so for instance, there's philosophy professor, law professor, or theology professor, or political science professor, but they're connected to the Institute. So the curriculum is very rich and varied. You'll take, we have required courses, we have some electives. We also, I'll come back to this, please remind me to do it, but we have a great internship opportunity that you can do also for credit. But you'll take a course in natural law and natural rights with a great Catholic thinker named Bradley Lewis. You'll also take a course in modern Christian political thought by another great professor in the School of Politics, David Walsh. Or you'll take a theology course, perhaps in human anthropology, with a famous, a lot of people have heard of him, I'm sure, Chad Pecknold, who is, writes a lot. And it's a rich and varied curriculum. And I'll say one other thing. We have a capstone course in the second semester, which the purpose of which is to draw everything together, to look at human rights through the Catholic social thought and Catholic perspective. And I teach that, but at least this year, and I hope in the future, but at least this year, is co-taught by a Monsignor who used to be in the Vatican diplomatic service. So he served at the UN. And part of my background is that I served at the UN, not for a long time, but under President Bush, George W. Bush. And when I was there, this Monsignor was there representing the Holy See. So we've known each other for a long time. We're old friends. And so the capstone course looks at particularly human rights and the Vatican's engagement globally with this issue.
Wow.
So it's I think it's a pretty exciting curriculum.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And I'm also really interested in this. I understand that the MA program has been entrusted to the patronage of St. Josephine Bakhita. Why did you choose her as the patroness of this program?
You know, she's kind of like an old friend to me. I know that many people listening have heard of her, but I first learned of her when I was working in the Sudan. And the Sudan, as most people will know, is just south of Egypt. And there was a religious and cultural genocide going on there. And I was founded a human rights organization to work in the area where they were genocide was going on. And it's a long story. Maybe I'll write it in a book sometime. But it was very difficult to get in. It was we had to kind of sneak in. There was a civil war going on, and these people, the government of Sudan's National Islamic Front was a Islamist radical regime, and they wanted to eliminate everyone who was not a radical Islamist. So they killed Christians, and there was also the enslavement of Christians. Now, it was intense, and so we got involved to try to do two things: to raise the public profile of the issue and to raise funds to take in relief, because sadly it was the UN, which does a lot of good work, wasn't doing great work here, because the area where the worst genocide was taking place was the UN was a no-fly zone. So they had made an arrangement with the government that other parts of the country could be served by relief, but not this area. Anyway, so we were the lifeline to this area. So when I was going in there, trying to help these people, and meeting them and talking to them, I would hear them talk about Bakita, and at that point, blessed Bakita. And
Mm.
I eventually found out who Bakita was. I do have a little picture of her, which I'll hold up for folks to see. They've probably seen her image
Yeah.
before, but she is from 100 years before we were in there, because there has been a long-term kind of cultural, uh, the black Southern Sudanese have been taken in slavery for at least under the Ottoman Turks, and so she was taken as a slave, and she was kidnapped from her family, and she was eventually, believe it or not, bought by an Italian merchant. At that point, um, I'm not sure that I don't think slavery was illegal in Italy, but in any case, he took her back to Italy. She was in Italy. She became acquainted with a religious order because the child of the family that owned her was sending that girl there for instruction. She took instruction, and kind of beautifully, uh, you know, kind of saw the dignity. She realized her own, inherent dignity, and so she refused to go back with them as a slave, and she stayed at that convent. And the Italians loved her so much. And anyway, she was kind of the doorkeeper. And there have been other, I think Solanus Casey, there have been others who've
Yeah.
been doorkeepers who become great saints because people come to the door and they get some advice, really, and counsel from these people. So she became a great saint. So I'll show another picture. So the only time I've ever attended a canonization, although I would have liked to have been there for Newman, I couldn't get there, is this right here, which is her canonization
Oh,
uh,
wow.
in the Jubilee year. In the Jubilee year of 2000. And it's on the same day as Margaret Drexel and the Chinese martyrs. So it was incredible. So why is she the patroness? Because she, I mean, I don't know. I could try to sum that up, but it should be pretty obvious. She is a great Catholic saint who suffered, and uh, yet became a true Catholic, forgave the people who kidnapped her, and in fact said that that God had used that for good, because she eventually knew, or she understood and knew the name, learned the name of the God she had encountered as a child but didn't know. So I think she is a great exemplar of a human rights person and a Catholic, in the sense that, well, she's not a great political leader. She is a saint who prayed for people, but her life is a great example of the dignity of every human person. I mean, in Sudan, there's a word that the Northerners use for the Southerners, and Northern Sudan is culturally and racially mixed racially and culturally Arabic, and the South was Black African and a mix of religions. Although the good news is now the Christian faith is the majority religion in the South. But in any case, they used a word for people of the South, which they took as slaves, and it was the Arabic word for firewood. So
Wow.
so they don't consider this a human being. They consider it firewood. Well,
Wow.
that's a theological, philosophical, and political error, which the Catholic faith and the Catholic teaching, the Catholic political and social teaching, rejects that and teaches the contrary. So that's why she's the patroness.
I mean, it's such a beautiful thing to think about her being the patroness of this. I mean, she represents the people that you're fighting for human rights, people who, you know, I think about some of the things that happen at the UN, and, you know, the fact that there are so many, you talked about, you know, the left kind of taking over the United Nations or human rights in general. And, you know, so you see them trying to contracept the third world out of existence. You see a huge push for things like making abortion a fundamental human right. And these are the people like Josephine Paquita. These are the people who suffer from that.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. It's you know, Catholicism insists on the inherent dignity of each person. I would say the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also recognizes that principle. So far from being a left-wing document, it's a very solid document that the left tries to use against, really against defenseless, powerless people. I just want to give you an example I've thought about, or an analogy about human rights, which is, you know, okay, we got the Super Bowl on Sunday. So
Mm-hmm.
most people in America will watch the Super Bowl. Okay, if the Super Bowl comes up on Sunday and the two teams playing are Kansas City and San Francisco, if Kansas City stays in the locker room, doesn't come out on the field, doesn't contest the game, San
Mm-hmm.
Francisco wins.
Yep.
Period. There's no you can't win unless you contest, unless you get in and fight for the truth. So I personally, and I hope people listening, refuse to concede human rights to the left. And it's not a left-right issue. I mean, the Catholic understanding transcends left and
Exactly.
right, but it recognizes the dignity of the human person and each human person. The human rights, kind of an informal slogan we have for the program, is human rights for human beings. If you're a human being, you have human rights. It doesn't matter if you're a teeny tiny human being or a very old human being or a black human being, you know, or a man or a woman or whatever. If you're a human being, you have human rights.
Most definitely. And I want to get back to that tiny person being a human being in just a little bit to ask you about your new book. But let's go back to talking about the program a little bit here. What kind of professional advantages do you think this program offers?
Well, I think I know that people listening and many young people have debt from college. And a lot of people think about going to law school, for instance, but law school's 3 years, and it's 3 years of going to build your debt. So in fact,
Yeah.
you know, and I think just use Washington D.C. as an example, because that's where I live and where I've lived for a long time. Many people get law degrees, and then they want to do, for instance, excuse me, work in public policy or something. Maybe they want to work on staff in Congress, or they want to go into the administration or the State Department, or they want to whatever. And so a lot of times people think the general degree to have is a law degree. You know, that's a plausible
Sure.
point of view. But if
Yeah.
you want to kind of get the public policy formation from the Catholic perspective and have a degree where you will have taken some law school courses. So, you know, you won't be, sometimes people get into, I'm a lawyer, you know, and you may be a lawyer too, I don't know, but people get intimidated
No,
by lawyers.
not that smart.
Well, people get intimidated by lawyers, and sometimes they shouldn't be. I mean, um, you know, so they will have had some law courses, so they'll know, they won't feel intimidated by people who've been to law school. So then I think they're able, they have enough formation and enough experience to get jobs and look for jobs in Washington or in the state capital where they're from, or in the diocese where they're from, because dioceses have peace and justice or other named offices which do different kinds of things, or work with a non-governmental organization. So in other words, it's a focused degree that gives them the opportunity, I think, to be competitive with anybody. Now, will it be that some employers dismiss you because you've got a degree from Catholic University? Maybe, but you know, we've got a very distinguished advisory board, and which we can talk about in a minute. But anybody who looks at this program and honestly looks at it academically, it's outstanding. We have the kind of professors I mentioned before, Chad Pecknold and others. Then we have this distinguished advisory board. So I think that it really gives people an opportunity in 1 year to get a degree in which they can go out and join the public conversation, both, I mean, through the kind of jobs I mentioned, but also maybe they just get a job in a business. Big multinationals are worried about their so-called human rights footprint. They, you know, for various reasons, they want, you know, some good, some bad, but some PR related, but some sincere. They don't want to do bad things in countries in which they work. But if they don't have good people, not good people, but people making good arguments about what human rights are, they will get on board in a country and promote things that aren't human rights. And I know a couple of young folks that I've talked to over the last 2 years who've told me in their companies this issue comes up, and they really are searching and thinking about what should we support, what in, you know, in a country in Asia or Africa or someplace where we're doing business. And I want our people, if I can put it that way, in the room to say, well, you know, we could decide to do X, but X isn't really a human right. And when somebody says, well, of course it is, to come back and explain, you know, gently and clearly why it isn't a human right, or why something else is. So I think it prepares people for a variety of careers. I think in that sense, it's another advantage that it's you know, flexible in the sense that it doesn't, you wouldn't have to do just one thing with this. I think it'll prepare you to do a variety of different things.
Probably doesn't hurt that you're located in Washington either.
Right. Yeah, no, that's the excellent point. I mean, I think that the two distinctives of our program from any other in the country is, number one, the Catholic perspective, and number two, being in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
For those of you who haven't been to Washington, D.C., it's just two subway stops from Capitol Hill. Obviously, Capitol Hill, the committees, the congressmen, the senators, you know, the staffers, the public policy world, at least nationally, this is where it is. Sometimes people, you know, don't, you know, I think fairly talk about people inside the Beltway being consumed with that. But if you want to be inside the Beltway and involved in some of this stuff at the national level, this is the place to be. And I think that is a big advantage of the program.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned this distinguished advisory board, which is has quite a few names on there who are personal heroes of mine. Why don't you tell our viewers about this advisory board?
Yeah, they're heroes of mine too. Even though some of them are actually, you know, kind of contemporaries of mine, but they're all my heroes. There's so many. Let me just start with Mary Ann Glendon, who is a Harvard law professor. She is, I think, the most influential, or the most important and influential voice on human rights in the country. She has written several books that are superb, including one that I know anybody who wants to take the program, you know, and wonders about what to read in advance, you could read one of her books called A World Made New, which is about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and is a great analysis about it, and kind of really sees it from the Catholic perspective, which is all the good that's in there and what we can work with. But she is also the chair of a commission set up at the State Department to look at human rights and U.S. foreign policy. So the U.S. has a big impact around the world. How should that foreign policy reflect human rights? How should it think about human rights? How should it decide what's important and not important? So she's the chair of that commission, which is holding hearings here and is going to write a report, which will have a big influence in U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah.
She is one of the people on the advisory board. Another one is Robert George of Princeton, which probably all the people listening know who he is.
He's everybody's hero.
Yeah. He's a great man. He's
incredible.
Done great things. He and I actually went to law school together. So he's a great supporter of the program, and I think he has tweeted out various things about the program. And he's, a great thinker, and he's also been on various commissions like the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Mm-hmm. Another member of the advisory board is Tom Farr, who's the president of the Religious Freedom Institute. Mm-hmm. And just another kind of fun story about how small the world is. I met Tom Farr when I was at the State Department for a meeting about Sudan. So this was 25 years ago, or 20
Wow.
years ago. So I go to the State Department, and I had a law school friend who had a high office at the State Department. I was going to meet with him, and Tom comes into the room because he's a career Foreign Service officer. And so from that moment, again, he shares the same perspective about the importance of human rights and religious freedom. And he's gone on after he left the State Department to set up the Religious Freedom Institute, and he's a great voice for religious freedom, which, yes, to remind the listeners, John Paul II and others have said religious freedom is the first freedom. Without religious freedom, everything else is kind of a joke, because religious freedom includes the kind of constitutive aspect of it. Is you are able to orient, you're able to find your deepest truth and orient your life towards the truth. So another member of the advisory board is Father Kevin Flannery, who is a professor of philosophy at the Gregorian University in Rome. He is he's a great philosopher. He's written many books about ethical aspects, technical things as well as non-technical things. He's an old friend and a longtime supporter of human rights and the pro-life cause. I mean, we should be clear, and there's no equivocation. I mean, human rights is pro-life. Without that, again, John Paul II, the first right is the right to life. If you don't have the right, or as a lawyer would put it, the right not to be arbitrarily killed, then you have no rights at all. So he's another one on the board. Another one is Professor John Keown, who is the Rose Kennedy Professor of Christian Ethics at Georgetown University here in Washington. He's an Englishman who used to be a professor at Cambridge University, and he is, in my opinion, the #1 authority in the world on assisted suicide and euthanasia. He was getting his PhD, he was getting his PhD at the time that the Netherlands was starting to legalize assisted suicide. And so he's been involved from the beginning in that. And again, small world department, but he was getting his PhD with the great John Finnis, the great legal philosopher, at the same time Robert George was. So we have all known each other for a very long time. John DiIulio, who's professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and who has always insisted on a full, rich Catholic view of human rights. As I said before, it must include, or I would say be based on, the right to life and the right to religious freedom, but it goes beyond that. It includes other issues on which we have to have concern for and do our best to help and solve social issues. So it's not, in other words, it's not a narrowly political thing, human rights. It includes, the dignity of the human person calls out to us for a response. And if they are in need or they are in distress, how we respond to that is a different question, a question of prudence and etc. But that we care, that we respond is a requirement, I think, of Catholic social thought. Let's see, also have the great Helen Alvary, who is, probably everybody listening knows who Helen is. She is professor of law at George Mason Law School here in Washington, and she was the pro-life spokesman for the Bishops' Conference, and she's started various organizations, and including one for Catholic women. She's served on Vatican delegations, and I think, I hope I haven't forgotten anybody. I'm kind of doing it off the top of my head, but anyway, that's the advisory board.
That's quite a list. Definitely incredible list of names there. And that's not to mention you as the program director. I mean, you've been kind of peppering here and there your experience in this area of human rights. But just from a personal standpoint, Bill, like what got you interested in human rights? What got you passionate about fighting for human rights?
I have been, it's interesting because some people would look at my, if we use the word career, and say, well, you've done this, you've done that, like you worked on life issues, you worked on religious freedom issues, you worked in a human rights group, you worked in a pro-family group, you worked at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, my life doesn't fall into political categories, which is good, because I don't think it should. Because I think the Catholic call is to go beyond political categories. But for me, and like I mentioned, I went to law school with Robert George. I am a convert. Kind of everything in my life is about conversion. I mean, I believe, just like John Paul II did, that the world is full of people of goodwill with whom we can have a discussion and persuade, because I'm one of those people. I was not always a pro-life person. I was persuaded. And I was persuaded by two great Catholics. One, of course, I've mentioned over and over so far, which is John Paul II, who again, I just don't think there's, in my opinion, he should be called John Paul the Great. He had a huge impact in the world. The other one was Governor Robert Casey of Pennsylvania. And many of your listeners won't know this, but Governor Casey, so back in the Democratic convention, I'm not sure if it was 94, 96, but Casey was the governor of Pennsylvania, the fifth largest state in the Union at the time, population-wise. And the Clintons were in charge of the party. So the party, Democratic Party, was, quote, pro-choice. Well, Casey didn't believe that. He was pro-life and he wanted to speak. And if you've ever seen a political convention, Democrat or Republican, it goes on for days and everybody speaks. Everybody speaks. They denied him a microphone. That was very powerful because I had heard Governor Casey speak at Catholic University actually a year before that. And now so I went to Harvard Law School. Okay. So I had heard, and I'd grown up as a kind of a, I don't know, typical American. I hadn't thought of, not a typical Catholic American, but a typical non-Catholic American. I hadn't thought a lot about abortion at all, and I hadn't thought very deeply about anything. But I went to law school, and I was fed this narrative about how abortion was a kind of that Roe v. Wade was not a stark departure from American history, law, and tradition. That abortion had kind of been here and there in the common law, and this Roe v. Wade was, if anything, a development of that. And Governor Casey, who just blew that apart, and I heard him speak, and I realized that I had been lied to. I had been fed a narrative that was not true. It is not true that America traditions were pro-abortion. It's just the opposite. And it's also, you never hear the fact that America started to, doctors, the more they learned about the biology and the embryology of the human, of the unborn, became more pro-life. So laws were becoming more and more pro-life in America. Anyway, Governor Casey just opened my eyes in a way that I could never have predicted. It just opened my eyes, and so I started looking. I started thinking, well, if that isn't, if that whole narrative is not true about abortion, what else is not true? And I started looking, and at the same time, John Paul II is, what do you call it? Bestriding the world. I mean, he's such a world historical figure. And anyway, it just kind of dawned on me. I started listening to him and started reading him, and his, once you realize that the unborn is a human being from the very first millisecond, then there's a whole logical progression you have to follow into the pro-life position, because abortion is, if anything, even worse than slavery, because abortion actually snuffs out the life.
Sure.
And so when I saw that, what institution had been telling that, there's a lot of malarkey in the world, but what institution had been telling the truth, about the most important thing? So that combination, I think, of Governor Casey and John Paul II, it changed my life. I realized I had to do something about it. And being a lawyer and somebody who'd been to Harvard Law School, I had, a number of opportunities. And so I started working at Human Rights Group. And the funny thing about that is, the Human Rights Group was not very, it's a good group, good secular group, but therefore most people were not interested in religion. So even though religion is listed on the Universal Declaration and in every treaty, it's a fundamental human right. So whenever stuff would come in the office about religion, they'd bounce it over to me to look at, and I was glad to do it. But it was through that I met the bishops from Sudan, who asked me to get involved in Sudan, which led to me setting up an organization to work in Sudan, and everything else over the years. So that's a long answer to your question.
Well, it's a long history that you have with human rights, so justifiably long answer. But let's, in the interest of time, because we are getting close to, we want to be considerate of folks' time. We've only got about 10 or 15 minutes left. Let's talk about some of the particulars of the program right now. First of all, tell us a little bit more about the curriculum and the length of the program.
Yeah, well, it's designed to be done in 1 year. So, but that's a heavy academic load because it means 5 courses in 2 semesters. Um, Now, I have students who are doing it and doing very well. So it can certainly be done. But for somebody who has a full-time job, we're going to have a part-time option available starting next fall,
Oh, cool.
where they can, keep working and not take the full load. But if you do take the full load, in less than a year, you can have a master in arts and human rights from the Catholic University. Can I mention one thing, because I don't want to forget this, and it has to do with the curriculum. Uh, we have, if you go to the webpage, mahumanrights.com, you'll see the curriculum. And one thing that we don't have up on the webpage, which we will get up, is you can take an internship for credit.
Mm.
And this is great because, a part of our program is not just the curriculum, but what we add on top of the curriculum. So in the fall, we have people come in to speak about their own lives, how they got into human rights, what they're doing, for many reasons, because I want the students to meet people who are doing this work. I want them to hear how other people ended up where they're doing, and I want them to hear about why people are doing what they're doing. So we had people come in from groups against human trafficking. We had Tom Farr. We went to Tom Farr and the Religious Freedom Institute so they can meet both older people like me and younger people who are working there in the office and get to know them and see what's going on. So we have all that going on in addition to the classwork, but we also have in the second semester an option for an internship for credit, in which you can go to one of these organizations and work, including could be people in Congress as well, on staff who are doing human rights work, or who are doing religious freedom work, or doing anti-trafficking work, and have an internship for credit where you can see exactly how they do it. You can network yourself into all kinds of people that you meet in that organization, outside that organization, at conferences and other things, and really enrich what you're doing and maybe lead to the job you want to take when you get your degree.
Very cool. That's awesome. Now, who would you say, or what qualities go into an ideal candidate for an MA in human rights?
Well, I think it has to be somebody, although, you don't have to be a Catholic. We have a student who's not a Catholic in the program, but I think it helps if you are at least, well, let me put it this way. You have to be interested in wanting to know the Catholic perspective. This isn't a catechism class, and we're not going to insist anybody, become a Catholic, or we're not going to monitor whether you go to Mass or any of that stuff. But we are unapologetically, 24/7 Catholic. We think that's the richest, most complete, true view of human rights. So you have to, if you want a secular human rights program, don't come, because it isn't going to be that way. So I think you have to be somebody who cares about, who cares about human rights. Now, you might not have thought much about human rights before, and you might have been turned off by some of the stuff you've heard from the left, but you have to know in your heart and realize this dignity of the human person. Any society that doesn't respect it, whose laws aren't built around that, is off track. So you have to have that instinct. You have to be very interested in the Catholic perspective. I think you have to want to then reflect that in whatever you do in work. I imagine most people will go into public policy, but you don't have to. Like I said, I think if you think, well, I'd like to go to work for, X big multinational, but I want to enrich my what I bring to this organization by learning about the Catholic perspective. So if you're interested in public conversation about issues that matter, that's an important qualification.
Okay, so let's get down to some business here, Bill. I mean, what are the application requirements for the MA in Human Rights?
Yeah, well, you have to, send in your transcripts. You have to have an interview with me. You have to, we have GRE, although sometimes the GRE in certain circumstances can be waived if you've been out, working for a while, or you have such an outstanding record. Excuse me, there's possibility of waiving that. Of course, you have to have references three references who, really say good things about you, and give me the sense. You basically have to convince me that you have the intellectual ability to do the work, and you have the personal characteristics or the personal virtues that you're going to work hard and make the thing work and take advantage of the opportunities. The technical, there may be some other technical requirements that are up on the web page, but that's the general requirements for the program. So you have to be a college graduate, etc.
Julia asks, how large is the program and what percentage of applicants are accepted?
The program, well, right now we have a class of 5, which is what we wanted. It's our first class. We want the program to be successful from everybody's perspective. So we want to build it slowly, but on a solid basis. So next year we will probably have 7 or 6, 7 or 8, probably 7, I would guess. I don't know what percentage of the applicants are accepted. I will tell you, I've already seen a couple of applicants for this next class that are extremely impressive. And I will tell you.
So don't expect to get in this year then.
Well,
just kidding.
One thing I would say about that is, you need to apply. You need to start the process through the official kind of CUA application portal, which you can get to through our webpage, the mahumanrights.com webpage. And the reason you need to do it is because there's a series of steps that the administration will, the university will ask for this, that, or the other. You need to get your application completed. If you want to try to get a waiver of the GRE and you don't have it, you need to get everything else done and ask for that. And also we have scholarships, which we haven't talked about, which is important. We have partial merit scholarships, but it's not an endless fund. It is not a bottomless fund. So the sooner you apply and get your get your file completed so it can be considered for a scholarship, the better. But we do have scholarships that can reduce the cost of the program by 1/3 to 1/2. And,
wow.
Kind of the sooner the better you can get in. I mean, like I said, we're expecting to have a class of 7 or 8. We don't want to grow faster than that to begin with. I mean, we may eventually go up to a program level of 15 or even 20, but not right now, because this class has gone very well and these students have had a great experience, and I want to make sure that continues.
Sure. And I know you mentioned the scholarships, but also that there is this discounted rate over other graduate programs, which I think is an important thing for people to know as well. What is the deadline to apply? I know you said the earlier the better, but is there a hard and fast deadline?
Well, the university deadline that applies to all programs is just the 1st of July. Excuse me. But practically speaking, and we've decided to have the priority deadline for scholarships is the middle of February. So, I mean, last year we had a student or two, I don't remember exactly, come in late, in May or whatever. So, but I can just tell you, I think it's a good rule for life. It's certainly a good rule for this. The sooner the better. Get it started, because you need to focus your thinking. There may be things you need, like there's a woman I know who's applying who's from Mexico, and she had to go through a lot of stuff to get her transcripts translated and approved. So I know probably for U.S. citizens, that's not going to be such a big deal or anything, but there could be similar things. So you want to get in the process. If you have specific questions, you want to ask them to me. I'll respond to anybody by email. My email address is on all our publications and stuff. And get yourself eligible for a potential scholarship too.
I have your email address written down here, saunderswl@cua.edu. Hopefully a lot of folks' questions have been answered by our conversation tonight, Bill, but as you said, if there are any questions or anything you want to discuss further, you're very responsive to your emails.
Yeah, very much so. I'm happy to answer questions. If you haven't begun the application process and you're just thinking about it, I mean, today, I sent several emails to people who were just making an initial inquiry for information. Another good thing that you will get if you get in the process is we have videos. For instance, last year I had a conversation with Robert George for an hour about human rights, and that's available to you. This year we had a hour-long discussion of the situation in China with Chen Guangqin, who is the famous blind Chinese activist, who is a distinguished fellow at Catholic University. I was actually interviewed on EWTN, I think last summer, about St. Josephine Bakhita. We have that, so you can get into the process, start getting the information, and get your applications completed.
And again, it's mahumanrights.com, where you can find all of this information and find this video archived very soon on the website. We've been talking to Bill Saunders, who is the program director for the MA in Human Rights at CUA. And Bill, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I did too. And, I just hope that we can, continue to form people to take this great tradition, the Catholic intellectual tradition on human rights, out into the public square, because one principle of Catholic social thought is the common good. And believe me, you will contribute to the common good if you take this into the public square.
Most definitely. I thought I would end with a prayer through the intercession of St. Josephine Bakhita, if you don't mind. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Loving God, rewarder of the humble, you bless St. Josephine Bakhita with charity and patience. May her prayers help us, and her example inspire us to carry your cross and to love you always. Pour upon us the spirit of wisdom and the love with which you filled St. Josephine Bakhita. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you so much for joining us for this information session. Again, mahumanrights.com, and I'm Anna Mitchell from the Sunrise Morning Show. If you want to learn more about my show, sonrisemorningshow.com. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and God bless you.
Thank you.